One of the most toxic concepts that is floating about on the internet is the insidious idea of true love. Also, what makes it especially insidious is that psychologists seem to buy into the concept and want to normalize it. The concept of true love is subjective, and is often used in a circular fashion. Like if you talk to a fanatical believer in true love, and point out that love doesn't last between men and women, and is in fact conditional, they will just point out that it is not true love, as true love lasts a lifetime. If you ask them how do you know if it will last a lifetime, they can't answer. So in other words, you can only find out if it lasts. Love is just a chemical reaction in the brain, that is where the feelings come from. It is nothing more than that, there is nothing deeper to it than that. Yet it is something that is to be religiously chased according to most tradcons. Anyway, let's listen to someone called Dr. Todd Grant talk about shallowness and how to spot it.
Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can provide the signs that somebody is a shallow person, right? So shallow means one thing in the world of mental health, like shallow affect, and a slightly different thing in the popular culture. I'll answer this question by looking at the 8 signs that you are a shallow person. So shallow affect really means showing little or no emotion, right? It's also called flat affect. Not affect, like cause and effect, but affect with an A, A-F-F-E-C-T. And this really means facial expressions and other behaviors that indicate mood, like having a frown or crying. Counselors use affect to figure out how people are feeling. And in general, people use affect to figure out how other people are feeling. This idea of shallow affect is just one part of being shallow in the popular culture sense of the word. Now, the type of shallow used in the popular culture refers to somebody without true emotional depth, complexity, or intellectual curiosity. So it's not just the shallow affect component when you talk about the popular culture use of that term. So shallow isn't necessarily bad, and having depth isn't necessarily good, but shallow usually isn't considered socially desirable. For example, we see this expression that a person can be hard to spend time with. Often when we hear that, somebody's referring to someone else with a shallow nature.
That is a new one to me. I have never heard anyone go, "I do not like hanging with that person, he is too shallow." In fact, you could argue that shallow people are good at socializing, as they can be good at superficial shallow small talk. Bty the way I do not see the science in this just seems like subjective value judgments. Psychology is a pseudoscience as far as I am concerned. In fact, psychology has a bias against people who do not like superficial socializing right now, and seems eager to pathologize this trait.
Also, shallow is not a mental disorder, although it's studied in the context of ideas associated with certain personality disorders, like narcissistic and histrionic personality disorders. Now, as I mentioned, the term shallow really captures 2 dimensions. So the first would be a lack of intellectual curiosity. If somebody had intellectual curiosity, that would be considered depth. So what I'm really talking about here is layers of intellectual thinking that are absent. So somebody may have a high IQ, but they don't have the layers of thinking. I've known plenty of people who are exceptionally intelligent, but they didn't have intellectual depth. This property of depth, this intellectual curiosity, or the lack thereof, is captured on the openness to experience trait in the 5-factor model, the big 5 personality traits, and more specifically on a facet of openness to experience called ideas. Sometimes it's also referred to as intellect. So that first dimension was lack of intellectual curiosity. The second dimension would be a lack of affective depth, and shallow affect could be a part of this. We also see the lack of an ability to mentalize, otherwise known as the theory of mind. So if somebody can mentalize, they can understand their own emotions and they can understand the emotions of others. So again, the absence of this points toward being shallow. Now, if somebody has only intellectual depth, but they have no affective depth, they usually still seem shallow. If somebody has emotional or affective depth without intellectual depth, they may seem shallow as well. like their emotions are not backed up by an understanding of how emotions work.
Yes, like women worshippers. They do not understand their own emotions or the emotions of the women who they pander to. They do not understand the contempt the women they are in relationships with hold them in. They lack insight and perspective, and fail to learn from their mistakes. Every time they get burnt pandering to women, they take a short break and then look for the next one to pander to. They never stop to question if pandering to women is a good idea or not. You can say that is also a sign that they lack intellectual curiosity as well. By the way, I wouldn't claim my insights are science, and Dr. Todd Grant should not claim his insights are based on scientific understanding either, as that is very irresponsible.
What emotions mean, or what causes them. A great example is the perpetually happy person who can't explain why they're happy. They don't reference constructs that are usually tied to happiness, like relationships, a sense of purpose, spirituality, sacrificing for others. So they're happy.
You can smell the tradcon right here. Of course he believes relationships make people happy, but they can of course make people miserable. Also, most likely being a tradcon, he believes that sacrificing for others is good and will make one happy. Watching porn and playing video games can make one happy as well. Of course Dr. Todd Grant would most likely frown on behavior like that, and call it addictive. Dr. Todd Grant most likely believes the status-seeking treadmill is normal and is what one should strive for in life.
But they don't know why. It's like shallow happiness, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. So now moving to the 8 signs that you're a shallow person. Now with these signs, they don't necessarily definitely point to being shallow. They're just associated with the construct. So sign number 1 is being narcissistic. And this is often the case for grandiose narcissism, so lack of insight, sense of entitlement, feeling special or unique, and being manipulative. Somebody who's a grandiose narcissist is more likely to be shallow. But vulnerable narcissists are a bit different. So a vulnerable narcissist is distrusting, they have a sense of shame, low self-esteem. Vulnerable narcissists aren't necessarily shallow, but they certainly appear shallow. So an analogy here would be if you had a lot of highly skilled workers who are not compatible to accomplish a task. So if you wanted to build a house and you had a welder, a computer programmer, an accountant, and a mechanic, all highly skilled individuals, but they don't have the right skills to build a house. Now compare this to a properly formed team that is appropriate for that particular task. That's really what we see here with the vulnerable narcissist. The vulnerable narcissist has disorganized depth. The raw material is there, but they don't know how to convert the depth into a sense of purpose or really bring it to life.
I believe psychologists tend to value conformity far too much. They value conformity and fitting in social groups, even if the values the group hold are toxic and harmful to the people within it, or the values are based on falsehood and hypocrisy. For example, psychologists have put extreme shyness in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There can be good reasons why someone is shy and avoidant. For example, if you put yourself out there too much, you increase the risk of getting falsely accused of sexual harassment.
In one sense, they understand it, they have all the pieces, but they can't solve the puzzle. Another way to think about it is the depth is locked behind a door. Consider for a moment something like borderline personality disorder, right, or borderline personality traits. Those are similar to vulnerable narcissism. People with borderline personality disorder aren't necessarily shallow. I would actually argue that there would be a better chance that somebody with that disorder would be deep. But their difficulty is unlocking that depth. The person with borderline personality disorder has depth, but it's locked away from them. They are searching for ways to get to it, and they are unsuccessful. They're looking for intimacy, meaning through relationships, but they're never satisfied for long. The depth is elusive. They are engaging in what seems like a deep activity, looking for true love, but they can never access that depth.
Looking for true love is deep? Only in your subjective opinion. How is this based on science at all?
So moving to sign number 2, that a person is shallow, we see that they are psychopathic. Typically, psychopaths are affectively shallow. So again, what I talked about in terms of like the mental health aspects. They may have impressive intellectual depth, but again, both need to be present, typically, for somebody to be considered deep. So they would be categorized as shallow. Sign number 3 is that the person is a poor listener. And this only applies some of the time. When someone is not interested, when they're forming their own thoughts while somebody else is talking, that really points toward being shallow. Some people may not listen, though, because they are lost in their own thoughts or having an internal dialogue, especially somebody who's very high in openness to experience. That's an entirely different situation. That person could be deep, but not social. So again, with listening, we have to be a little bit careful because poor listening comes from a few different places. Moving to number 4, we see the individual does not believe in true love or in a meaningful romantic relationship. Now,
this is pure nonsense, and the fact Dr. Todd Grant sprouts this nonsense on a YouTube video that introduces itself as being based on science is laughable. The concept of true love is vague and subjective. Dr. Todd Grant is trying to frame a disbelief in this concept as something pathological and a sign that someone is shallow. The feeling of love is based on sentiment and emotion. There is nothing deep about love. Why do people fall in love at first sight if love is so deep? Someone likes the look of someone else, and falls for them instantly. Also, feelings of love have a lot to do with pheromones. If someone likes the smell of someone, they are more likely to develop feelings of affection for them. In fact, someone who rejects the concept of true love is most likely someone who has reflected on the subject, while someone who believes in true love and chases it mindlessly is far more likely never to have thought of the subject at all. You see, women worship and unthinking obsession with relationships is the norm throughout the world. One of the reasons why psychology is such a massive fail is because it takes the current paradigms of the culture for granted, and assume that they are normal healthy behaviors one should strive for. Psychology is very biased when it comes to relationships and favors the female perspective, and assumes that male pandering to women is healthy and normal, and what is expected in a mutually respectful relationship. The main beef I have with the pseudoscience known as psychology is the fact it is trying to pass itself off as science, and thus make appeals to its own authority. I do not even consider psychology a soft science. The problem is psychology has to give people what they want, and many psychologists have status and careers linked to their pseudoscientific field. Most people do not want to hear hard truths. One trait I noticed in regards to male status seeking is the fact men are less likely to be honest and objective if their status is linked to falsehoods. Most people want to conform and fit in. This is doubly so for men with less social license than women to non-conform, so most men will want to be told how to fit in and conform, so they can get their status. Men want to be told how to shape up, get over their hang-ups and then be able to find the girl. This is why a clown like Jordan Peterson is so popular. Men do not want to change society, they just want to fit in and get status. That is why all men are willing to worship people who give them advice telling them to put up with abuse from women. As it stands, psychology is nothing but pseudo-expertise. Gynocentrism in the soft sciences is very problematic, and feminism is allowed to infest it and corrupt the soft sciences. This is starting to become a problem in the hard sciences too, but that is for another video. That is all for now. The rest of this video is not worth replying to, as it hasn't got anything to do with my points. Anyway, let's end the video listening to Jordan Peterson rambling his nonsense. He is a good example of the vague and toxic nonsense that people offers as profound insight. Here he is trying to justify men being submissive to women in relationships, trying to frame it as being challenged. This idiot is a professor with tenure. This is how much of a joke the field of psychology is.
Order surrounded by chaos, right? It's like a tree. It's like the evolutionary home of primates, the tree with the snakes on the ground. That's our landscape. Or it's the fire for tribal people, and the terrors of the forest that are beyond the the light that the fire casts. It's explored territory versus unexplored territory, and that's an archetype as well. You can't not be in a situation where that's the case. Even if you're among friends, you know, you think that's explored territory. That's not exactly right, because what happens if you're among friends is that they carefully reveal new parts of themselves all the time. So it's like they're blasting little elements of unexplored territory at you constantly. And if they don't, then what happens? You get bored and you look for new people. And we know there's empirical data on that with regards to intimate relationships, because there was a nice study done a while back showing that, looking at the ratio of positive to negative emotional experiences that were most predictive of long-term relationship success. And the answer was, now obviously it depends on how you would measure an event and how you would measure positive and negative emotion, but that aside, the finding was something like, if you're in a relationship and you only have 5 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction, then the relationship will end. It's too negative. But if you have more than 11 positive interactions to 1 negative interaction, then it also ends. And you think, well, that's pretty bloody peculiar. Why in the world would that be? Don't you want like 100 to 1 positive to negative interactions? And the answer to that is, what makes you think that you want a relationship so that you can be happy? Or at least happy moment to moment? Why do you think that? It's certainly not the case. You know that too, because I bet you there's not a person in this room who hasn't rejected someone because they were too nice to them. Something like that. Person's no challenge. It's something like that. You want someone who, you know, you can get along with them, but now and then they bite you and you think, oh, that's interesting. You know, I didn't really expect that. And then you go and puzzle over it for a while and you torture yourself about it, and that's one of the things that keeps you really linked into the relationship. And the reason for that is that part of the reason that you want the relationship isn't so that you're happy right now. It's so that you can live a high quality life across multiple decades. And so you're looking for someone that you have to contend with, who's going to push you beyond what you already are, and who's going to judge you harshly often for your limitations. Now that'll make you angry and all of that, you know, and resentful, and maybe you'll take your revenge and all of that, but you don't want someone who thinks you're perfect in your current form, partly because why would you want to go out with someone that deluded?